The smell of fresh coffee and homemade pie always filled the air at Joey's diner every Thursday evening. Among the regular customers was a young black man in his early 30s who worked as a software engineer at a nearby tech company. Everyone knew him for his kind eyes and gentle demeanor, though few knew his full story. He would arrive just as the evening rush was settling down, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder and his tie slightly loosened after a long day of coding and meetings. The bell above the door would chime, and the waitresses would smile, knowing exactly what he'd order: the house special meatloaf with extra mashed potatoes and green beans on the side. The usual spot, one of the older waitresses would ask, already reaching for a menu she knew he wouldn't need. He'd nod with that warm smile of his, the one that made the corners of his eyes crinkle just a bit. The corner booth by the window had become his unofficial office away from home, where he'd sometimes pull out his laptop to finish up work while enjoying his dinner. The diner sat in a predominantly white neighborhood, and he was often the only black customer there. Sometimes he'd catch curious glances from other diners, or notice how new customers would do a double take when they walked in. But he never let it bother him. This place felt like home, and the regulars had come to see him as part of the Joey's Diner family. The owner, an old-timer with salt and pepper hair who everyone called Pop, would often stop by his table to chat about everything from the weather to the latest tech news. Pop didn't know much about computers, but he loved hearing about the young man's work, even if most of it went over his head. "You're making the future happen," Pop would say, refilling his coffee cup without being asked. That particular Thursday started like any other. He arrived at his usual time, just as the sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The diner was busier than usual. A high school basketball game had just finished up down the street, and families were streaming in for post-game meals. The familiar sounds of clinking plates and friendly chatter filled the air. He settled into his corner booth, exchanging warm greetings with the staff. The vinyl seats squeaked slightly as he sat down, a sound that had become oddly comforting over the years. A new waitress, still learning the regulars' orders, approached his table with a fresh pot of coffee and a slightly nervous smile. "Good evening," she said, fumbling a bit with her notepad. Before she could continue, Pop's voice called out from behind the counter, "That's our Thursday special guy. Get him the meatloaf plate, extra mash." The new waitress looked relieved, and they shared a knowing laugh. As he waited for his meal, he pulled out his laptop to review some code from work. The screen's soft glow illuminated his face as his fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard. He had a big presentation tomorrow, and he wanted to make sure everything was perfect. The diner's warm atmosphere helped him think better than his quiet apartment ever could. The regulars around him went about their usual routines, the retired couple sharing a slice of apple pie, the taxi driver grabbing a quick burger between shifts, the high school teachers grading papers over endless cups of coffee. It was a slice of small-town life that felt increasingly rare in their fast-paced world. What made this place special wasn't just the food, though Pop's meatloaf was legendary in these parts. It was the feeling that everyone who walked through those doors could find a moment of peace, a friendly face, and a hot meal served with a side of genuine human connection. In a world that often felt divided, Joey's Diner was a reminder that community still existed, that simple kindness still mattered. Little did he know that this ordinary Thursday evening was about to become extraordinary, and his regular dinner at Joey's would set in motion events that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone in this small community. As he sat there, savoring his coffee and working on his presentation, he had no idea that in just a few minutes he would be faced with a choice, one that would reveal the true character of not just himself, but of everyone around him. The steady rhythm of the diner was interrupted by the arrival of a group of teenagers, still wearing their basketball jerseys from the game. They'd burst through the door with the boundless energy of youth, laughing and talking loudly about their victory. The bell above the door barely had time to finish its chime before they claimed the largest booth, their voices filling the previously peaceful space. At first, it was just typical teenage excitement, nothing unusual for a post-game celebration. The young software engineer glanced up briefly from his laptop before returning to his work, used to the ebb and flow of diner life. But then something caught his attention, a sound that didn't belong among the happy chatter and clinking dishes. 3 booths away sat an elderly man, probably in his 80s, dining alone. His hands shook visibly as he tried to lift his soup spoon to his mouth. He wore a worn but clean sweater vest and had a cane propped against his table. There was something dignified about him, despite his fragile appearance, the kind of dignity that comes from a lifetime of standing tall. The group of teenagers had noticed his trembling hands too, but their reaction was different. What started as whispered comments and poorly hidden snickers soon grew into more obvious mockery. One of them started mimicking the old man's shaking hands while trying to drink his soda, causing his friends to burst into laughter. "Hey, Gramps, need a sippy cup?" one of them called out, just loud enough to be heard over the diner's background noise. The old man's shoulders hunched slightly, but he kept his eyes fixed on his bowl, pretending not to hear. His hands shook more now, causing his spoon to clatter against the bowl. The other diners noticed what was happening. A middle-aged couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. The taxi driver shifted in his seat, looking like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should get involved. One of the waitresses hovered nearby, obviously distressed but hesitant to confront the group of rowdy teens. Pop was in the back kitchen, and the new waitress seemed overwhelmed, unsure how to handle the situation. The teenagers, emboldened by the lack of intervention, grew more daring in their taunts. They started taking videos with their phones, trying to capture the old man's trembling hands for their social media entertainment. The software engineer watched as a drop of soup missed the old man's mouth and fell onto his sweater vest. The elderly gentleman's face flushed with embarrassment as he tried to dab at the spot with his napkin, his movements slow and uncertain. In that moment, the engineer saw something in the old man's eyes that made his heart ache, a mixture of shame and resignation that had no place in a neighborhood diner. The teenagers' laughter grew louder. "Maybe we should get him a bib too," another one called out. The old man's hands were shaking so badly now that he had to set his spoon down. He stared at his bowl of cooling soup, his dignity being stripped away with each passing moment. The air in the diner had grown thick with tension. The usual comfortable atmosphere was replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by the teenagers' cruel laughter and whispered comments. Regular customers exchanged glances, each waiting for someone else to step in, each feeling the wrongness of the situation but hesitant to confront it. The young engineer looked at his laptop screen, where his presentation still waited for final tweaks. He had an important meeting tomorrow, and he knew from experience that standing up in situations like this could bring unwanted attention, could make things complicated. Being the only black man in the diner already made him stand out. Getting involved would only make him stand out more. But then he remembered something his grandmother used to say: "Your character is defined by what you do when you think nobody's watching." He looked again at the elderly man, saw how his shoulders curved inward, as if trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. The engineer realized that sometimes the right moment to act finds you, whether you're ready for it or not. His coffee had grown cold, and his meatloaf was only half eaten. Outside, the sky had darkened completely, and the diner's windows reflected the warm light inside like mirrors. In that reflection, he could see the whole scene played out: the laughing teenagers, the uncomfortable onlookers, the distressed old man, and himself, sitting there with a decision to make. The next few seconds would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone in Joey's diner that Thursday evening. As he slowly closed his laptop, he knew that sometimes the most important choices in life don't announce themselves with fanfare. They slip in quietly, disguised as ordinary moments, waiting to see what you're made of. The soft click of the laptop closing seemed to echo in his mind as the young software engineer rose from his booth. At 6'2", he naturally drew attention when he stood, his business casual attire neat, but somehow more imposing when he was at his full height. A few nearby diners glanced his way, curious about what he was going to do. He took a deep breath, remembering all the times in his life when he'd had to choose between staying quiet and speaking up. The teenagers were still laughing, one of them now attempting to film the elderly man's struggles with his phone. The old gentleman had given up trying to eat his soup entirely, his weathered hands resting in his lap, his eyes fixed downward. His footsteps were quiet on the diner's worn linoleum floor as he approached the teenager's table. He could feel eyes following him, the waitresses, the regular customers, even Pop, who had emerged from the kitchen after hearing the commotion. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everyone's shadows on the floor, merging and overlapping like a silent audience. "Good evening," he said, his voice gentle but carrying a weight that made the teenagers' laughter fade instantly. They looked up at him, their expressions a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. The one with the phone slowly lowered it, suddenly aware of how their behavior might look to an adult. "You know," he continued, pulling up a chair from a nearby empty table and sitting down to be at eye level with them, "my grandfather used to be a high school basketball coach." This wasn't what the teenagers had expected, not a scolding, but a conversation. Their defensive postures softened slightly. "He could sink free throws better than anyone I knew," he went on, his voice warm with memory. "But last year, he couldn't even hold a cup of coffee steady. His hands would shake just like that gentleman's over there." He gestured respectfully toward the elderly man who had looked up listening. "Want to know what my grandfather told me?" he asked the teenagers, who were now sitting quietly, their earlier bravado fading. "He said the hardest part wasn't the shaking. It was seeing people treat him differently, like he wasn't the same person inside." The teenager who had been filming quickly slipped his phone into his pocket, his face flushing. "I bet you all have grandparents," he continued, noticing how some of them nodded. "They'd probably come to your games, right? Cheer for you even when your team's down." More nods, and now he could see something changing in their eyes. Recognition, maybe even a bit of shame. He leaned forward slightly, his voice still gentle but serious. "That gentleman over there, he's someone's grandfather too. Maybe he used to play basketball. Maybe he taught kids like you. We don't know his story, but I know he deserves to enjoy his meal in peace, just like any of us." The diner had grown completely quiet. Even the usual kitchen sounds seemed muted, as if the whole place was holding its breath. The teenagers looked at each other, then at the elderly man, seeing him differently now, not as a target for their amusement, but as a person, someone who reminded them of their own loved ones. The team captain, who had been quietly listening, stood up first. "We're sorry," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We were being jerks." The others followed his lead, mumbling apologies. The young engineer noticed their coach's words had taken root. They were acting as a team even in this moment of accountability. As the teenagers gathered their things to leave, one of them approached the elderly man's table. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "I'd like to pay for your meal. And I'm really sorry about how we acted." The old man looked up, surprise and gratitude softening his features. The young engineer watched as the teenagers filed out, their earlier rowdiness replaced by quiet reflection. Through the diner's windows, he could see them gathering in the parking lot, their conversation serious, some wiping at their eyes. Back inside, the regular rhythm of the diner slowly resumed. Conversations started up again, plates clanked, and the coffee maker hissed. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. A reminder that sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing up to anger, but reaching out with understanding. As he turned to head back to his booth, he caught Pop's eye. The old owner gave him a nod that said more than words could. The new waitress was beaming as she rushed to refill the elderly man's water glass, and the other diners, who had been silent observers, now wore expressions of quiet approval. That's when the elderly man spoke up, his voice stronger than anyone expected. "Young man," he called out, "would you join me? My soup's gotten cold, but I'd love to order a fresh bowl and share a meal with someone who reminds me that kindness hasn't gone out of style." The young engineer moved his laptop and coffee to the elderly man's table, settling into the booth seat across from him. Pop himself came over with 2 fresh bowls of soup, steam rising in delicate swirls above them. "This one's on the house," he said with a warm smile, setting down a basket of freshly baked cornbread between them. 42 years I taught at Pine Grove High School," the elderly man said, carefully wrapping his weathered hands around the warm bowl. "Chemistry." His hands still trembled, but there was pride in his voice. "Got to see thousands of young people discover their potential in my classroom." The software engineer leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Pine Grove? That's where I went to school." He paused, doing quick mental math. "I must have just missed you, though. I graduated in 2009. The old man's eyes lit up. "Oh, you must have had Mrs. Chen for chemistry then. She was one of my star students, you know. Came back to take over when I retired." He chuckled softly. "She still calls me every Christmas." As they talked, the usual dinner crowd thinned out, but neither of them noticed the time passing. The elderly man shared stories about the old days at Pine Grove, The science fairs he'd organized, the experiments that had gone hilariously wrong, the students who still sent him letters after all these years. "My wife used to say I had two families," he said, his voice softening at the mention of her. "The one at home and the one at school." He paused, stirring his soup absently. "She passed away last spring. 53 years we had together." The young engineer noticed how the old man's hand gripped his spoon a little tighter at those words. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "That must be very hard." "The silence is the hardest part," the elderly man admitted. "All those years of someone finishing your sentences, knowing exactly how you like your coffee, laughing at jokes only the two of you understand. And then suddenly it's just quiet." He looked around the diner. "That's why I come here most evenings. The noise, the people, it helps." The young engineer thought about his own evening routine, how he'd chosen this diner partly for the same reason. "Sometimes family isn't just about blood," he said. "Sometimes it's about finding places and people that make you feel at home." A comfortable silence fell between them as they finished their soup. The elderly man's hands were steadier now, more confident. Perhaps it was the warmth of the food, or maybe it was simply having someone to share it with. "You remind me of one of my former students," the old man said suddenly. "Bright young man, always stood up for others. He went on to become a civil rights lawyer." He looked at the engineer thoughtfully. "It's not just about having courage, you know. It's about having the wisdom to use it kindly." The conversation shifted to the young engineer's work. He tried to explain what he did in simple terms, but the elderly man surprised him with his understanding. "The principles don't change," the old teacher said with a twinkle in his eye. "Whether it's chemistry or computers, it's all about solving puzzles and making things work better." As the evening wore on, other diners came and went. The new waitress stopped by occasionally to refill their coffee cups, smiling at their animated conversation. Through the diner's windows, they could see the sky had turned to deep purple, streetlights casting warm pools of light on the sidewalk outside. "You know," the elderly man said, checking his watch with mild surprise, "I haven't talked this much in months." He looked up at the young engineer, his eyes clear and bright. "Same time next Thursday." The software engineer smiled, realizing he found something he wasn't even aware he'd been looking for. "I'd like that," he said. "I'm here every Thursday anyway. It'll be nice to have company." As they prepared to leave, Pop came over with 2 slices of his famous apple pie in takeout containers. "Can't send my favorite customers home empty-handed," he said with a wink. The elderly man's hands shook slightly as he took his container, but this time there was no embarrassment in it, just the natural tremor of age, accepted with dignity. They exchanged phone numbers, written carefully on diner napkins. "Just in case," the elderly man said. "Though at my age, I'm more likely to forget where I put my phone than to actually use it." They both laughed, the sound mixing with the familiar diner noises, the clinking of plates, the hiss of the coffee maker, the gentle murmur of conversations around them. Standing at the door, they'd realized neither had mentioned their names all evening. They'd connected over stories and shared experiences, finding common ground in the simple act of showing kindness. As they finally introduced themselves properly, both men knew that this chance encounter had grown into something meaningful, a friendship born from an act of courage, nurtured by understanding, and sealed over soup and conversation in a corner booth at Joey's dinner. Morning sunlight streamed through the trees as the young software engineer walked toward his car, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He was running early for once, hoping to review his presentation one last time before the big meeting. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the sound of birds and distant traffic breaking the morning calm. He was thinking about the evening before, the elderly teacher's stories, their shared connection to Pine Grove High, the promise of future Thursday dinners together. His keys jingled in his hand as he approached his car, but something made him pause. A police cruiser had just turned onto his street, moving slowly. His heart did that familiar skip, the one that came from years of learned caution. He'd done nothing wrong, he reminded himself. He was just a man walking to his car on a peaceful morning. Still, he found himself mentally rehearsing his movements, slow, deliberate, visible. The cruiser pulled up nearby, and a female officer stepped out. She was about his age, maybe a bit younger, with her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her expression was professional but not unkind. "Good morning, sir," she called out, keeping a respectful distance. Do you have a moment to talk? He nodded, keeping his hands where they could be seen. Of course, officer. Is everything all right? We received a call last night about an incident at Joey's diner, she said, pulling out a small notebook. Someone reported a large man intimidating a group of teenagers. She paused, studying his face. The caller seemed quite concerned. A mix of emotions washed over him, frustration, disappointment, but also a strange sense of tired familiarity. Of course, someone had seen a black man standing up to white teenagers and immediately assumed the worst. The weight of that assumption sat heavy in his chest. I understand, he said quietly. I was there last night, but I think what the caller saw and what actually happened might be two very different things. He noticed how the officer was listening intently, not interrupting or making assumptions. Would you mind telling me your version of events? She asked, her pen poised over her notebook. There was something in her tone, not accusatory, but genuinely interested in hearing his side. So he told her everything, about the elderly man trying to eat his soup, about the teenagers' mockery, about choosing to approach them with kindness rather than confrontation. As he spoke, he could see something changing in the officer's expression. I've already spoken with the diner staff, she admitted, closing her notebook. And the security footage backs up everything you're saying. The owner? Pop. He couldn't stop singing your praises. A small smile crossed her face. He said you handled it better than he would have. The tension in his shoulders began to ease, but there was still something he needed to say. Officer, he began carefully. I have to ask, if the caller had described a white man talking to those teenagers, would you be here right now? The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, she seemed to really consider the question. Honestly, probably not, she said finally. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? She sighed, pushing her notebook into her back pocket. I've been on the force for 6 years, and I can't tell you how many calls we get that are really just about someone's prejudices. It must be difficult, he offered, having to respond to every call, never knowing if it's a real problem or just fear wearing a different mask. She nodded, then seemed to make a decision. Look, I'm working with our community relations department. We're trying to build better connections, especially in neighborhoods like this where assumptions sometimes get made. Would you be willing to share your story at one of our community meetings? The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows on the pavement. In the distance, a school bus picked up children, their laughter carrying on the morning air. It was such a normal morning, except for this conversation that felt anything but normal. You know, he said thoughtfully, the elderly gentleman I met last night, he spent 42 years teaching chemistry. He said the most important lesson wasn't in any textbook. It was about seeing past the surface, understanding the deeper reactions. He smiled slightly. Maybe that's what we all need to learn. The officer extended her hand. Thank you for your time this morning. And thank you for what you did at the diner. That's the kind of community intervention we need more of. As they shook hands, she added, I'll have to file a report on this, but I think we can close this case as community member assists in positive youth intervention. As she turned to leave, she paused. One more thing, those teenagers. Their coach called the station this morning. Said his team had learned an important lesson about respect and kindness from a stranger at a diner. Sounds like you made quite an impression. Watching the police cruiser drive away, the young engineer felt something shift inside him. The morning suddenly seemed brighter, full of possibility. His phone buzzed. A text from the elderly teacher. Thank you for last night. Looking forward to next Thursday. He smiled, unlocking his car. Sometimes the hardest conversations could lead to the most important changes, and sometimes those changes started with something as simple as soup in a diner and the courage to be kind. The big presentation went better than expected. As the young software engineer packed up his laptop, several colleagues stopped to congratulate him. But his mind was already elsewhere, thinking about the morning's encounter with the police officer and everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Back at his desk, he found an email from the Community Relations Department of the local police. The female officer had already started the ball rolling, inviting him to speak at their next community meeting. As he read through the email, his phone lit up with a text from the elderly teacher. Hope your presentation went well. Pop just called, says the soup's extra good today. He smiled, remembering he needed to review the security footage from the diner. The officer had mentioned it during their morning conversation. Taking a deep breath, he called Joey's Diner, and Pop answered on the second ring. "Been waiting for your call," Pop said warmly. "Listen, about that footage from last night. I've watched it a few times now. You know what stands out? It's not just what you did, it's how you did it. Those kids could have gotten defensive, could have turned ugly. But you gave in a way to be better." The security footage told the story clearly. From the camera's angle, you could see everything: the teenager's mockery, the elderly man's distress, and most importantly, the gentle way the situation was handled. There was no aggression, no threats, just a simple conversation that changed hearts. "The morning shift told me those same kids came back for breakfast today," Pop continued. "Asked specifically about the elderly gentleman, wanted to make sure he was okay. Said they couldn't sleep last night, thinking about how they'd acted. After hanging up, he opened his email again and started typing a response to the police department. As he wrote, he realized this wasn't just about one incident in a diner. It was about all the small moments that could either divide people or bring them together." The community meeting was scheduled for the following week. As he confirmed his attendance, his computer pinged with another email, this time from the high school basketball coach. The team wanted to do something special, he wrote. They'd been talking about what happened, about respect and dignity, about seeing people as people. During lunch break, he walked to the small park near his office building. The same son that had witnessed his morning encounter with the police now watched him sit on a bench, unwrapping a sandwich from Joey's Diner that Pop had insisted on sending over. A group of kids played basketball on the nearby court, their shouts and laughter carrying across the park. An elderly couple walked past, hand in hand, the woman's steps slow but steady. Everyone had a story, he thought. Everyone deserved to be seen, to be heard, to enjoy their soup in peace. His phone buzzed again. The female officer had sent a follow-up message. The police department was reviewing their response protocols for complaint calls, looking at how bias might influence both the reporting and handling of situations. She wanted his input on their new community engagement initiatives. As the afternoon sun warmed his face, he thought about how a simple dinner at Joey's had turned into something much bigger. The teenagers learning empathy, the police department acknowledging the need for change, a friendship formed over soup and stories, all because someone chose kindness over silence. A notification popped up on his phone, a reminder to pick up some books he ordered. One was about teaching chemistry, a surprise gift for his new Thursday dinner companion. The other was about community building, something he'd been thinking more about since last night. Walking back to his office, he passed the diner. Through the window, he could see Pop chatting with customers, the new waitress gaining confidence as she handled the lunch rush. The place looked different somehow, more than just a diner now. It had become a reminder that change was possible, that communities could grow stronger, one conversation at a time. The afternoon stretched ahead, filled with meetings and deadlines, but his mind kept returning to that moment in the diner when he closed his laptop and stood up. How different things might have been if he'd chosen to stay silent, to look away like everyone else. His phone lit up one more time. A message from the elderly teacher asking if he'd like to meet earlier next Thursday. "Thought we could help Pop with the early dinner crowd," the message read. "Show those young folks what real teamwork looks like." As he typed his reply, he smiled, thinking about how a simple act of kindness had rippled outward, touching lives in ways he never expected. The security footage, the police report, the teenagers' return visit, all of it painted a picture of what was possible when people chose to see the best in each other. The rest of his workday flew by, but he hardly noticed the time passing. His mind was already looking forward to next Thursday, to more stories shared over soup, to being part of something that felt like positive change in motion. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest changes started with the smallest choices, like standing up in a diner when it would have been easier to stay seated. 3 months had passed since that Thursday night at Joey's Diner. The place looked different now, not because of any physical changes, but because of the life that filled it. The evening sun still painted the same warm patterns through the windows, but the light seemed to fall on a community transformed. The young software engineer and the elderly teacher had kept their Thursday dinner tradition. Their corner booth had become something of a landmark in the diner, with regulars knowing it was reserved for their weekly meetings. But they weren't alone anymore. Their table had a way of attracting others, growing larger each week as more people joined their conversations. Tonight, the high school basketball team was celebrating their championship victory. Instead of taking up their own space, they'd pulled chairs up near the corner booth, listening intently as the elderly teacher shared stories about the science behind their sports drinks, making chemistry sound like magic. The female police officer had become a regular too, stopping by for coffee during her evening shifts. She'd brought about real changes in the department, new training programs, community outreach initiatives, better ways of handling calls that might be rooted in bias. But more importantly, she'd helped build bridges between law enforcement and the neighborhood. Pop had put up a new sign in the window, "Welcome to Joey's, where everybody has a story." It wasn't just words. He'd started a tradition of his own, letting customers write their stories in a leather-bound book that sat by the register. Some were just a few lines, others filled pages, but each one added to the growing tapestry of their community. The new waitress wasn't new anymore. She moved confidently between tables, knowing everyone's usual orders and their stories too. She'd started college classes, inspired by the conversations she overheard during her shifts, particularly the elderly teacher's passionate discussions about education. The teenagers who had caused the initial incident, they'd become regulars too, but in a different way. Every other weekend, they volunteered at the diner, helping elderly customers with their trays, reading menus to those with failing eyesight, learning that service to others was its own kind of victory. One wall of the diner had been transformed into a community board, covered with photos and notes. There was a picture of the elderly teacher giving a guest lecture at the high school, surrounded by eager students. Another showed the young engineer speaking at a community relations meeting, the female officer standing proudly beside him. The diner had become more than just a place to eat. It was where people came to really see each other. On any given evening, you might find a teenager helping an elderly customer use their smartphone, or a police officer sharing coffee with local residents, learning about their lives and concerns. Pop had started hosting monthly community dinners, where everyone paid what they could, and those who couldn't pay were welcome just the same. These gatherings had become legendary, with people from all walks of life sharing food, stories, and laughter. The young engineer's company had noticed the changes too. They'd started a mentorship program with the local high school, inspired by his stories about the elderly teacher. Now, twice a week, tech professionals spent their lunch breaks teaching coding to students in the same classroom where the teacher had once taught chemistry. The local newspaper had run a story about Joey's Diner, calling it a blueprint for community healing. But those who were there every day knew it wasn't about making headlines. It was about the small moments that happened between people who might never have spoken to each other before. Tonight, as the young engineer and the elderly teacher shared their usual booth, they watched a scene unfold that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. A group of teenagers was helping an elderly couple with their heavy plates, while another customer taught Pop how to use video chat to connect with his grandchildren. The female officer stopped by their table, sliding into the booth with a smile. "You know," she said, "calls about suspicious activities in this neighborhood have dropped by 60%. Turns out, when people know each other's stories, they're less likely to assume the worst." The elderly teacher's hands still shook as he lifted his coffee cup, but now it was just another part of who he was, like his wit and wisdom. No one stared or whispered anymore. Instead, they listened when he spoke, drawn in by his stories of 42 years, teaching young minds to question, to wonder, to grow. As the evening wound down, Pop brought over their usual slices of apple pie. "You know what?" he said, pulling up a chair. "I've owned this place for 30 years, but it never felt like this before. It's like that one Thursday night woke something up in all of us." Through the diner's windows, they could see the neighborhood settling into evening. People walked their dogs, waved to neighbors, stopped to chat on street corners. The same streets, the same buildings, but somehow different, warmer, more connected. The young engineer looked around at the familiar faces, at the community that had grown from a simple choice to stand up and speak kindly. He thought about how change happens, not always in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in small acts of kindness that ripple outward, touching life after life, story after story. The elderly teacher reached across the table, his hand steady for a moment as he patted the engineer's arm. "You know what the real chemistry is?" he asked with a twinkle in his eye. "It's not in any textbook. It's right here in what happens when people mix together and create something new, something better. As they finished their pie, the diner hummed with the sound of people connecting, learning, growing together. Outside, the evening star appeared in the darkening sky, shining down on Joey's diner, a simple place where one act of kindness had started a chain reaction that was still changing lives, one story at a time.